what the people of Radcliffe need as well, isn't it? And that's our desire, that they would know that they've been made to worship, they've been made in the image of God to worship their God and to give their praise and their worship back to him. And we've been reminded of that in this last week with the awful events that happened just around the corner on the bridge there. And please pray for Radcliffe, especially if you're from Radcliffe and you live in Radcliffe, but even if you're not, Radcliffe needs your prayers, and we as a church need your prayers as we seek to support the local community in this difficult time. And so what we're thinking about over the next few weeks is vitally important. How do we get the good news of Jesus Christ out to our town? How can we be the neighbours and the friends that our town needs us to be? I got a phone call from my friend Rob the other day. I've known Rob for a long time. Met him 13 years ago, and he was a wild chap, businessman, had a lot of money, party lifestyle, was on the guest list of all the nightclubs in Manchester. He knew the people who'd set up some of the famous nightclubs in Manchester, and was always inviting me out to these things, which I never went to because I can never decide what to wear. Like Morrissey, we'll go out tonight, but I haven't got a stitch to wear. And we remained friends for a long time. And a few months ago, he rang me up and said, "Guess what? He moved to Macclesfield," because that's what rich businessmen from Manchester do. And rang me up from Macclesfield and said, "Tom, I'm getting baptised." So that was amazing. And then he rang me a couple of days ago and he said, "Tom, I've been doing door-to-door work, and if you'd known Rob 13 years ago, you'd have I don't know what did I do? I had to sit down." And he said, "But I'm a bit confused because we've been going out doing these surveys in the local area. It's a way of connecting with people. And the survey goes something like this, questions like this: do you believe in God? 80% of the people said, yes, I believe in God. And another question was, would you like to know God? And 80% said, yes, I'd like to know God. And Rob's thinking, brilliant, I've not lost it. Even in the Christian life, I'm still the best salesman in north of London. And then, so he's thinking, I'm on a winner here, 80%. Oh, brilliant. 80% say, I'd like to know God. And then a question like this comes, would you like someone from the church to come and talk to you about how you can know God? 80% no. Would you be interested in coming to a church meeting where you can find out more about knowing God? 80% no. Not interested. In fact, I think he said it was more like 90%. And he asked me the question down the phone, "Tom, what's wrong with people?" And I said, "Well, Rob, 13 years ago, that was you. What's wrong with people? How would you answer that question? What's going on?" The surveys, they back this stuff up that Rob was discovering on his first evangelistic effort as a Christian. People have a sense that there's a God and they would like to know, if it was possible to know him, they'd like to know him, but church? Nah. What's happening in our nation? It wasn't always this way, was it? Maybe you've heard the story of a Muslim girl a few years ago who was in foster care, and she started to go to a local youth club, and she heard about Jesus, and she fell in love with Jesus, and she started to follow Jesus, and she said she had trusted Jesus and wanted to get baptised, and the Holy Spirit had clearly done a work in her life, and so her foster carer encouraged this and saw the change in her life, only for the foster carer to get struck off from being a foster carer and for that child to be removed because the foster carer was encouraging her to convert from Islam to Christianity. Maybe you know the story of a group of prominent scientists and politicians who at the moment are working very hard to get any mention of creation, even in RE lessons, completely banned in schools in Wales. Or have you heard about the MP in Finland, just over the ocean, who faces prosecution simply for quoting a Bible verse? She's facing criminal charges. Maybe you know about the move in the United Nations to alter, to edit, or to ban certain parts of the New Testament because they are anti-Semitic. They put the Jewish faith in a negative light. Europe is now the dark continent spiritually. Used to be, didn't it, a couple of hundred years ago, that they would say that Africa was the dark continent because there wasn't much Christian life there. But now that's very much not the case. And Europe is the darkest, spiritually the darkest continent in the world. It's expected that church attendance in the UK is going to drop to, regular church attendance is going to drop to about 1 in 25 in the next couple of years. 1 in 25 people in the UK regularly go into church, and nearly half the UK population, when asked, have no intention whatsoever of ever going to a church meeting ever in their lives. What's going on? What's going on is that the UK and Europe are now firmly secular. The days of Christian Britain, as we once knew it, are over. Would you say that's a good thing or a bad thing? The days of Christian Britain, Christendom, are over. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? There's lots been written about it. There was a chap who wrote a book called After Christendom. His name is Stuart Murray, and he analysed this shift to post-Christendom, and he analyses 7 transitions that happen when a nation goes from being a Christian nation to being a non-Christian nation, or even maybe say an anti-Christian nation, as it seems to be becoming in the UK. And it says that what happens is that the church moves from the centre of life, and everything's built around it, and laws are built on the basis of what the church teaches about the Bible, to the margins of life. And suddenly the church is marginalised, and it's on the edge, and it's seen as an inconvenience at best, or something to be attacked at worst. We've moved from the centre of life to the margins of life, and we can't expect people to know the Christian story anymore, can we? What's the vital message of Christianity? What's the overarching narrative of Christianity? The God who made the world, the God who sent his Son to redeem the world, the God who's sending his Son to come back and make all things new. People don't know those basics anymore. We're no longer at the centre of life in this country. We've gone from, another move is that we've gone from being in the majority to being in the minority. We can't expect a consensus of belief anymore around what we might believe in terms of ethics and so on. Are these good things, or are they bad things? Another movement is that we've gone from being settlers to sojourners or travellers or pioneers. Good thing or bad thing? We can't sit and wait for people to come to us anymore. Opening the church door and ringing the bell doesn't bring anybody in, does it? We've gone from privilege to plurality. In other words, we've gone from being the only real coherent voice about who God is to being one of many voices about who God is. We've moved from being, Christianity's moved from being that force which is able to control and dominate social conversation and lawmaking. We've been able to gone from being able to force the truth on people to now only being able to witness to the truth by the way we live our lives. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? We've gone from maintenance to mission. We've gone from being concerned to keep the status quo, keep everything as it is in society, because after all, Christianity is dominant, and we can force our views, and we can make sure that people bring our children up in the way that we want them to be brought up, and only teach them things that we would feel comfortable with them being taught. We've gone from being able to have that situation and just maintain it to now being on mission again, and having to explain things to people and show things to people in an authentic way. Now suddenly it really matters whether what we say with our words matches what we live in our lives, and people are watching. If you want to claim Jesus Christ, you'd better live Jesus Christ. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? We've gone from being the institution in the United Kingdom that everybody depended on to having to become a movement again and take new ground or retake old ground. We're on the edges again. We're no longer seen as the authority to be trusted. We've got to earn that right. And I want to suggest that it's not a bad thing that Christianity has been pushed out to the margins. I want to suggest that actually while Christianity was the dominant voice, there was a lot wrong with who we were and what we did. While we were just maintaining structures, while we had that privileged position where we could enforce truth on people and dominate people with our view of the truth, a lot went wrong. And while we thought that the only thing we needed to do was to maintain and to keep control and keep our privilege at the top of the tree and the foundation of British society, underneath it all, without us noticing, the church was dying. And it was nominalism that was killing the church. It was Christianity by name, rather than Christianity by a change of heart and a work of the Holy Spirit. There is no life in waking up one morning and saying, I am now a Christian. It's not what happens. But that's kind of the message that was taught, at least by implication. Just join us, and then you're a Christian. And this thing that's happening, the secularization of Britain and the marginalization of the church, is sending us back to our Bibles, isn't it? And it's making us say, God, speak. Show us something in here that we need. And that's not a bad thing at all, because in lots of ways that's bringing the Bible to life for us, isn't it? Because, the Bible is a series of documents that was written to God's people on the edges, God's people on the margins. When the Bible was written, God's people never enjoyed dominance of any kind. The whole of the New Testament in particular was written to Christians facing extinction at any moment. Christians who would never have dreamed that one day Christianity would have the privileged voice in society and be the thing that whole nations built their laws on. They would never have dreamt that, and they took hold of this missional document. They took hold of this encouragement for those on the edge, and they drank it in, and they ate it as quickly as they could and as hungrily as they could, because this word from God was their life. The government was not their life. Society was not their life. Their interests and their hobbies were not their life. Their religious routines were not their life. This book was their very life. And wouldn't it be great to be like that? And maybe, just maybe, God is doing that wonderful thing for us as Britain becomes more and more secular and we become more and more marginalised. And what we're thinking about over the next few weeks then is how do we need to change? How does the church need to change its perception of itself? How do we need to change our understanding of who we are as the nation changes? From assuming that when a Christian speaks they must be telling the truth, from assuming that what the Bible says is good, to thinking that the Bible must be banned. How do we live then if all of this is changing? The church, is designed to be on the edges of life. The church is designed to be on the margins. I'll go so far as to say this: it was never meant to be in relationship with the government, telling the government how they should run. That the head of state should also be the head of the church, I think is against what the Bible teaches. And that's part of why we've got to where we are, I believe. And I believe the day of the biblical church is about to dawn. The church that has this as their life and not national security or the making of government or anything like that. How do we live on the margins of society? One of the worst things that ever happened to the church was when the Roman Emperor Constantine declared Rome a Christian nation. That was the beginning of the end of the living church. And we're living in the last days of that, maybe. I want to suggest that what's happening in the UK then is no bad thing. It's bringing us back to our natural habitat, back to the landscape we've been designed to live in. But what do we need to change in order to live in these days? I wonder if you'll turn to 1 Peter with me. This is the letter that we're going to be studying over the next few weeks. 1 Peter chapter 1, I'm going to read the first 12 verses. few years before this letter was written, Emperor Claudius declared thousands and thousands of people living in Rome and in the Roman Empire non-citizens. He said, you are no longer citizens of Rome. You no longer have the protection of Rome. You can no longer have employment in the Roman Empire. You are now non-citizens. It's happening all around the world today. As a church, we've got contact with a lady from Kuwait, and recently Kuwait had a realignment of their who were citizens and who weren't, and a whole ethnic group in Kuwait declared non-citizens and had to leave, and they were in great danger, and it's been happening for thousands of years now, and it happened during the time of the Roman Empire, and this group of non-citizens included criminals and insurgents, terrorists, foreigners who'd come in to try and dismantle the Roman Empire from the inside out, and it included lots of Jews, and it included many, many, many of this odd group that had grown up in the Roman Empire called Christians. It was like a swear word back then, wasn't it? And they were sent to places like Asia Minor. And so when we begin to read in verse 1, when it says Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, he's the one who writes the letter, and he addresses it to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. These were all the places that non-citizens were sent to. These Christians, these people who had decided to declare Jesus Christ as their Lord rather than Caesar as their Lord, were declared non-citizens. And they lost all rights, all civil rights, all economic rights, all political rights. And they were in great danger, and they become strangers and exiles from their homeland. Their faith in Jesus Christ made them dangerous people, and they were sent away. And this letter is written to them. Living life on the edge, living life as rejects, living life as those to whom their people had said, you're no longer wanted here. Have a look at chapter 1, verse 17, for example. These are exiles. Live your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. This is not so much Peter telling Christians that they were foreigners, but that these Christians had been told, you're now foreign to us. We don't know you anymore. It happens in families, doesn't it? Hindu families in India and Muslim families in the Middle East. Somebody says they become a Christian, they say, you're dead to us. And that's who Peter's writing to. He says it again in chapter 2, verse 11. It keeps coming up, you're strangers and you're exiles. The people are going to be hostile to you. You've already experienced it. Chapter 1, verse 6. You're going through trials. You've had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. They'd seen family members taken and thrown into prison. They'd seen family members thrown to the lions. They'd seen family members set on fire to be candles to light up Caesar's garden parties. And now they've known themselves scattered into the far reaches of the world, places nobody would want to live, places like Asia Minor, and that list there in verse 1. And we're going to dive into this letter tonight, and we're going to dive into this letter over the next few weeks, and we're going to learn from this group of brothers and sisters of ours from 2,000 years ago. What was it like to live on the margins, and how can we be faithful from the margins? How can we be faithful as exiles? And there's only one thing I want to notice as we begin to draw to a close this evening. And it's this, that as Peter addresses these people, the first and primary thing he wants to call them to is the gospel of Jesus Christ. He celebrates the gospel with them. These verses, in the first 12 verses of 1 Peter, are awesome descriptions of the gospel of Jesus Christ. How do we live as strangers and exiles? Over the next 20 years, it could well be that doing what I'm doing now becomes illegal, and doing what you're doing now becomes illegal, and that the police come in and they check our Bibles and they say, is this the one that's been edited to make sure it's not anti-Semitic? No, it isn't. You're going to jail. How do we live? Are we ready? Peter having told them that you are strangers and exiles, he does not say, compromise to fit in. He does not say, see where their energy is and see if you can match it. See if you can do the same as them. See if you can tell them, well, yes, where you find liberty is where we find liberty too. Where you find life is where we find life too. And neither does he say, go on the attack. Neither does he say, condemn them all. He doesn't say, go on an angry rant. Or take revenge. And neither does he say, hide away in convents and monasteries and just mix with each other and make sure your children only marry other Christian children and just cover yourselves. No, he says, remember the gospel. Remember the gospel. And he celebrates it with them in verses 3 and onwards. Because these were people who have been rejected by Rome. They've been rejected by their government, kicked out. Can you imagine that if you got a letter one day that said, you've got 2 weeks to leave. We've heard you've been going to church. You are now a non-citizen. Lost your citizenship. Rejected by your government. But Peter says in verse 3, you've got a new citizenship. In his great mercy, he's given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Guys, you've lost your citizenship. You've lost your stability on this earth. You cannot depend on your government. You cannot depend on your police force. You cannot depend on the army to protect you anymore. You cannot depend on your employment rights. They're after you. But you've got a new citizenship. You've got a new place to go. And this is an eternal citizenship. We've been reborn. Those of us that are trusted in Jesus Christ have been reborn to a citizenship that will never fade. We've been given a new life that will overcome and has overcome death. In the face of opposition, in the face of marginalisation, celebrate the gospel. Don't let go of it. Don't water it down. Celebrate it. Hold it even closer and even more dearly than you did before. Because if God is for us, who can be against us? The way to deal with being attacked by our own is to celebrate the gospel. Not to compromise, not to attack back, but to remember, I've got a new citizenship. Verse 4, they'd had their economic prosperity taken away from them. They couldn't have jobs, a lot of them. They were kicked off the building projects. They were kicked out of their shops. Very similar to what IS did when they went through the Middle East recently. But Peter says in verse 4, you've got a new prosperity. You've got new riches. Verse 4, into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. You are rich beyond your imagination, Peter is saying. In the things that matter, you are multi-millionaires. You have a rich inheritance that will never, ever run out. Don't put your eyes on your bank balance. Don't put your eyes on your next promotion. Don't have your hope. Please don't have your hope set on your boss and whether they're going to give you a pay rise. Please don't put your life in the hands of a rock and roll band. That's what Noel Gallagher said, wasn't it? The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls. So we know it, don't we? New prosperity. Don't depend on the economic wealth of the United Kingdom. It's not real anyway anymore. You know, when they started to give us paper, there is no economic prosperity. By the way, that's the next thing that's coming down the line. But we won't go into that. Don't depend on your boss, will you? Because when you start losing your jobs, you're going to need a better prosperity than that. And this is the good news, you've got it. An inheritance that will never perish, spoil, or fade. And it's being kept for you. These are wonderful words, aren't they? We're supposed to understand this as a personal thing. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to take those words in verse 4 and say, God sees you, and he knows the gift he has for you, and he's got it in heaven for you, and no one else is going to be allowed to have it. It's yours. It's got your name on it. That's wonderful, isn't it? That waiting in heaven for me is a treasure all divine, and matchless grace has made that treasure mine. And God looks at that treasure, as it were, and he says, that's for Tom King. That's his. That's for her. It's wonderful to know, isn't it? And verse 5, we've got a new protector. He says, you who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. So not only is our inheritance being kept for us, we are being shielded so that there's no way that we won't get to our inheritance. That while we live on this earth and wherever we go and whatever we do, God is protecting us and keeping us, because if there's one thing that God wants for us, it's that we get to this inheritance. We spend a lot of time worrying about our future, don't we? Should I make this choice? Should I make that choice? Where should I have my education? Where should I go for my next job? Where should I live? Where am I going to be able to live that's going to help me to live as long as possible? Where can I live in comfort and peace and safety and security? Check the crime stats. If that's what you're living for, don't come to Radcliffe. But if you're living for this inheritance in heaven, and you know that God has got that for you and he's keeping you for it, you can go anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter. And God sees you and he knows you and he protects you and he says, mine. And as the old Puritans used to say, we are immortal. We are immortal until God calls us home. Nothing this world can do can kill us until God says the word. That's wonderful news, isn't it? We're being kept for that inheritance. And when that day does come, we have that inheritance. I was talking to my friend today, and he's just lost his dad. And he was describing to me the last few days of his dad's life. And I was very close to his dad, but I hadn't seen him for a few months. And I'm very close to my friend as well. And he was telling me, he had for the last few years, my friend had cared for his dad as he went through Alzheimer's and diabetes and all the complications of that. And they had a very close relationship, and he was describing to me today here, this morning, how he had been laying on the bed with him in his arms as he died. And it was emotional and it was heartbreaking to hear, but then he looked at me and he said, but Tom, I've got to worship. I've got to worship, not because I have to, because that's the thing to do, but when I saw him die, I've never seen anything like it. It was like looking at heaven. And he said, my sister, who's a nurse, who's seen so many people die, she said, I have never seen someone die like that before. Sister's not a Christian. And it reminded me of the day when when Nathan was born. And when Nathan was born, we were in the birthing suite, I think they call it. Nothing sweet about it. Suddenly the midwife thinks there's something wrong, and she takes the brakes off the bed that Gemma's lying on, and she rushes him down the corridor, and all that nonsense they tell you, by the way, men, about how important you are at the birth. It's not true. If anything goes wrong, you are kicked out with a quickness. And so Gemma disappears into this room, and she said that we couldn't hear the heartbeat and we don't know if he's breathing, and I'm walking around thinking this was the day I was going to meet my second son, but maybe I'm not going to meet him now, and what's happening, and maybe even my wife, maybe I'm never going to see Gemma again. And 20 minutes felt like an eternity. And then I heard crying, and Nathan was brought out to me, and I'll never forget in that moment, as our eyes locked, I had everything I needed in my arms right there. Didn't need anything else. And if you could have paused time right there, I'd have been happy standing there forever. And I said, Gemma, because he looked just like Gemma. And then he pooed. But we've got this future, haven't we? We've got this future coming to us, and it's in verse 7 there. We've got this new future. He says, these have come to you, these trials have come to you so that it can prove the genuineness of your faith, which is of greater worth than gold which perishes, even though refined by fire, so that they may result in praise, glory and honour when Jesus Christ is revealed. And this is what's going to happen when you see him. You're going to be transfixed in that moment, and you will need nothing. You will need nothing, and everything will make sense. Every hardship that you've ever lived through, every pain that has ever afflicted you will make perfect sense, and you will be able to stand there forever in the presence of Jesus Christ, and you will say, I'm okay. It's all good. It's all good. And we know there's so much mystery wrapped up in that. How can we, yards away from what happened, from the scene of what happened last week, say, one day it'll all make sense? But we believe it, don't we? We have faith that what Peter is saying is true. That one day we will see him, that the Lord Jesus Christ will be revealed, and we will see him, and we will know that all of the bad has been undone. That we have this great consolation, and it's all okay. We have this new future, don't we? And so what Peter's doing is he's writing to these people on the margins, he's writing to these people on the edge, facing persecution, facing possible death, rejected by their government, rejected by their neighbours, under attack, left, right and centre, no employment rights, no certain income for the future, no understanding of where their life on this earth is going to end up. But Peter says you've got something better than all of that. Rejoice in this. Though you have not, verse 8, though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy. For you are receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. This is what it's all about, church, isn't it? And Peter is saying, you've got this greater thing. You've got this greater thing. Stop depending on these lesser things. Guys, this is peeling our fingers off one at a time from all those things we hold so tightly onto. And it's turning us back to the Lord, and it's turning us back to his word. And don't we long for that? Don't we long for those days when we're not dependent on failing things anymore, on perishing things? And this gospel of ours that Jesus has secured for us with his life, death and resurrection is so wonderful. Peter is saying that it has this effect. We don't need to depend on this world anymore. We don't need to hold on to it so tightly. We don't need to be absolutely terrified when we lose our jobs. We don't need to be absolutely at our wits' end when our families say, we don't know you anymore. You're a follower of that loser from Nazareth who was crucified 2,000 years ago. You're dangerous. We don't need to cling on to those things so desperately anymore so that it breaks us when life goes wrong. And we can be so secure in these greater things that neither do we get triumphalist. That we're looking at other people thinking, well, we're better than you. You're attacking us, but we're better than you. But you see, the gospel of Jesus Christ, it does this other work in us, doesn't it? Where we just want to plead with people, as Jesus did when over Jerusalem, he said, oh, Jerusalem, how I would have gathered you. As a mother hen gathers her chicks. How I would have gathered you, but you would not come. Now Jesus says that to people who are about to crucify him. And it's only the Christian message, that can do that work in our hearts. It's only the gospel that can do that work in our hearts. Have you got any enemies, by the way? Got any enemies today? The way to resolve that anger, the way to resolve that hostility, the way to resolve that unresolved conflict is to throw yourself into this gospel and let it melt your heart so that you don't have any enemies anymore. Do you see what Peter's saying? You've got something so good. Why are you holding on to these other things? The foundation for living life on the margins is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and being so amazed by it that Peter says that we might have a joy in verse 8 that is inexpressible. Inexpressible joy. that the biggest smile on someone's face that you've ever seen does not express it. And the most beautiful, wonderful, elevated words in any language you could imagine does not express the joy that we have inside, so that you can take anything from me and it's like nothing. Do you remember those shops that started popping up in Millgate with the fish and you put your feet in? Where did they ever go? Whatever happened to them? And I never invested. Was it only Bury, or did they do it in other places as well? Was it just us?
Trafford Centre.
Did it at Trafford Centre? And then suddenly they disappeared, didn't they? Imagine if you'd walked past one of those shops one day. I nearly did this with a friend for a joke, but then he emigrated to Canada and I lost my bottle. But imagine how funny it would be to go into one of those shops and you might not find this funny, but I would put your feet in and then start shouting at the fish saying, "Give me my dead skin back! Give it back! They've got my dead skin! Give it back!" You see, sometimes as Christians it's like going into one of those shops and we're like, "Don't take my dead skin. What are you doing? Give it back." And Peter's saying, no, that's all perishing. Your job, your marriage, your friendships, your security, the police force, the government, the local authority, your house, this society, it's all just rotting away. You don't want to get it back off them. You want them to take it. Because look at what you've got. Do you think I should do that in the shop? If you pay me enough, I'll do it. You see, Peter's saying this, isn't he? This is what Peter's saying in these verses. The joy of the Lord is your strength. If you've got him, you don't need anything else. Anything else is just so much dead skin that just needs to be eaten up by some fish in a fish tank. And so we can celebrate, can't we? Begin to think about what it is to live life on the margins.